And that concludes questions for oral answer. I have received a letter from Andrew Little seeking to debate under Standing Order 389 the finding that staff of the Ministry of Transport were disadvantaged after they raised concerns about the conduct of Joanne Harrison. The finding was set out in the report of the investigation into whistleblower treatment within the Ministry of Transport released by the State Services Commissioner. The release of the findings on this matter is a particular case of recent occurrence for which there is ministerial responsibility. The matter raised by Mr Little is a very serious one. The public service has a reputation for professionalism and integrity. The findings in this case risk damage to that reputation. Public servants were disadvantaged for doing the right thing in reporting conduct that was later found to be criminal. Such cases are rare, but they deserve the attention of this House. I therefore call on Andrew Little to move that the House take note of an urgent matter of public importance. Order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This has been a most unfortunate episode in the history of the very fine public service in New Zealand and the reputation that it has established over many, many years and many decades. This has been a tawdry exercise and a failure by a government department and a failure of oversight by a minister who frankly knows better. That's right. So going through the factual background, we know that in 2013 concerns and questions were being raised by senior staff of the Ministry of Transport about the processing of invoices for that ministry. Invoices related to services taken on by the Organisational Development Group, which was an outfit within the ministry under the control of Joanne Harrison. The problems were that there were erroneous invoices, there were invoices that did not have sufficient explanation about what they were for, there were invoices from a single outfit which, when added up, were outside the threshold of arrangements that could be entered into without a contract. And in short, a lot of money was being paid to an individual outfit that, given the amount being paid, should have been the subject of a properly tendered contract, and that didn't happen. That went throughout 2013 and 2014. In late 2014, Joanne Harrison, the head of the Organisational Development Group, took a trip overseas to attend a conference, which it then turned out was a conference that had been cancelled before she left New Zealand. And so the full cost of that and appropriate per diems and other costs were then paid out by the ministry. In 2015, the ministry investigated changing its accounting and business processes so that it would introduce automated invoice processing. At that point, it was unrelated to the allegations being made by those staff who had raised concerns about the invoice. But this is where it gets interesting. Before the ministry had even taken on software for the automated invoice processing, before the ministry had changed its processes or started any implementation, a redundancy exercise involving staff in the accounting function who might have been displaced by the implementation of the new processes started and got underway. And it then turns out that advice on the redundancy process that affected staff in the accounting and financial section was the subject of advice from Joanne Harrison as the effectively HR kind of guru in the Ministry of Transport. And it turns out advice was given and taken for some inexplicable reason to let staff go before their positions were actually redundant. Here's what Sandy Beattie, the investigating official, said about this. Sandy Beattie was the one who wrote the report that was released a couple of weeks ago. She pointed out that she noted that the timing of the redundancies was interesting and had wondered why they were made 2 weeks before Christmas, when the ministry knew at that time that it did not even have a transition plan or any new technology in place for moving to the automated invoice processing. they let these people go. And then it turned out it was the people who had raised the concerns about the invoices, which related to an outfit connected to Joanne Harrison, who had applied irregular processes over those invoices. She went on to say, the Sandy Beattie went on to say, that the 3 redundancies in the finance team, premised on the introduction of automated invoice processing, occurred 7.5 months before the system even came into effect. And she went on to give her view, her conclusion, that at that time there was no legal justification for letting those people go on the grounds of redundancies. Their positions were not surplus to requirements at that time. And Sandy Beattie goes on to say, this is an area in which I conclude that Ms Harrison's influence played a part. There is no question what was going on here. Ms Harrison, having been caught short, having in fact been caught out at a very early stage, took steps to remove the people who were calling her out. And at that point, an important check and balance was lost within the ministry, which allowed Joanne Harrison to carry on committing fraud, which she was subsequently convicted of in 2016 and sentenced for earlier this year. Mr. Speaker, we rely on good, honest, hard-working public servants to be vigilant in their jobs day after day after day. And when they see wrongdoing, to be able to call that out, to have the comfort to call it out. And in fact, it's so important that this House passed legislation to afford those public servants protection for doing so. The Protected Disclosures Act is a vital part of the protection of taxpayers' and citizens' interests when it comes to the conduct of our public services. And so, Mr. Speaker, we had these staff making their disclosures, and in fact, one of the staff members formalised their disclosures under the Protected Disclosures Act. That Act has as its objects 3 principal things: allowing disclosure and investigation of serious wrongdoing. It has to be serious, but there could not be anything more serious than financially ripping off the organisation that you're a senior employee of, which is what these staff thought they were seeing. It turned out they were right. But at the time they had their suspicions, and they were right to have those suspicions, and they took the appropriate action to do it. The second thing that the Protected Disclosures Act is meant to do is to protect employees making those disclosures. That's what it's set up for. Because it is true, Mr. Speaker, that in some workplaces, including in public workplaces and government departments, there are sad characters who, when they are called out or called to account, get vindictive, intimidatory, bullying, and take action against those calling them out. The third overarching objective of the Protected Disclosures Act is, of course, to promote the public interest, and anything that makes sure that taxpayers' money is properly spent within its mandates, spent within the rules of the department whose responsibility is to manage it, that is in the public interest. These employees, these 3 employees did everything right. And it's very sad that one of them, who went on to get other temporary work and was found by their new manager to be so good, that they wanted to increase their pay. And when they went through to get authority to increase their pay, the person who blocked that in a nasty, vindictive, mean, miserable way was Joanne Harrison. She was not going to let go. We should be glad that she is behind bars. She is a vile person. But she has caused distress to the innocent lives of a number of public servants who were just trying to do their job. And the question is, what was the minister doing? It cannot be possible that the minister did not know what was going on. The chief executive knew what was going on. If the chief executive has suspicions of a fraud and requires an investigation to take place because he commissioned an investigation, he's got to let his minister know. It turns out that the Chief Executive's investigation exonerated Joanne Harrison, made some tweaks to the processes, but left everything to go as it went. Mr. Speaker, there is another disturbing aspect to this as well that it is timely to reflect upon. That is the culture of the public service. Not the thousands and thousands of public servants at all levels who day in, day out do their best, do their utmost, give good advice, work hard and do good things. It's at the senior level. And it's the legislation that governs the public service that has fundamentally changed the culture of our public service to one where increasingly good people, good public servants, are encouraged or incentivised or urged to work in the interests only of their minister. Actually, sometimes against the public interest. The sense of empires and kind of dung heaps emerging in our public service, so that the loyalty or the fealty of public servants increasingly is not to principles of good governance and incorruptible governance and good quality advice across the board, but to particular ministers and sometimes to their political advancement and furtherance. That's right. And that's not a healthy development. And what I see when I look at the report into this matter, the investigation that was conducted into the responsible and honourable actions of these excellent public servants, they saw values that went beyond just their department within the ministry. They saw values that went beyond just their ministry. It was about a good public service. It was about them being good public servants. But they were prevented from upholding those principles and those values by the culture of that organisation. Now, I don't want to cast aspersions on our very fine public service, and indeed of the State Services Commission and those others who are there responsible for inculcating that very important set of principles and values that underpin our public service. But when you have legislation that drives heads of ministries and agencies and departments to run their organisations as if that is the only thing that matters, as if only the interests of their minister matters, then we are in a very dangerous situation. And it means we have departed from those good, some might say old-fashioned, but good principles of a coherent public service that is there to serve the interests of all New Zealanders, and public servants who are there to uphold the entire public service through their actions and their conduct. That's got to be the aim and objective of every head of ministry and department and Crown agency and other public sector department. It is about upholding the public service and its integrity as a whole. But we have an architecture now which, in my view, Mr. Speaker, dictates or argues for behaviour that is not consistent with that principle. And this is the sort of thing that happens when we have that kind of design and architecture of our public service. So, Mr. Speaker, I say this. In light of the Sandy Beattie report, in light of Peter Hughes's stewardship of the report and now his commentary on it, the government, through whatever means, must take responsibility for what happened to those public servants, must own up to what happened, and must put right what has been done wrong to them. That does mean compensation. It will mean an apology. It might mean finding an opportunity for them, if they wish to do so, to return to the public service at the level of seniority that they were at the time that they were let go. Nothing less would be just. And so that commitment must be given. But the next commitment must be that this government must demonstrate, this Minister of Transport must demonstrate, the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister must demonstrate that they are serious about a public service that in all respects and across all its people, right from the Chief Executives of ministries and departments and Crown agencies, right down the hierarchy, acts at all times in the best interests of every New Zealand citizen and every New Zealand taxpayer. Right. We don't have legislation at the moment that incentivises or encourages that. And it might, Mr Speaker, just be time to review that, to review our public service, to make sure that those vital values and principles of good public service are being upheld and maintained. I do not see that in this report. I saw in this report too much accepting a single stream of advice from a senior public servant to the Chief Executive who turned out, this is the senior public servant, who turned out to be corrupt and a fraudster. And if we have a culture that allows that in the Ministry of Transport, I don't say it is happening anywhere else, but if it happened there, it can happen again. And we must be ever alert and ever vigilant to make sure that that never happens again. And above all, that good public servants are not hung out to dry and to lose their livelihoods when they step up to the plate, take responsibility, act honourably and preserve public service values.
Point of order, the Right Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, I just want to correct an answer I gave to a supplementary question